The secret didn't come from a leak, a rumor site, or an anonymous insider. It came from a voice fans had been trained to trust for more than a decade. In a moment that felt almost too casual to be calculated, Diana Gabaldon dropped a line that instantly sent shockwaves through the fandom. Within minutes, the phrase, "Outlander 2026 secret," began circulating with a single, unsettling question attached to it. Had the truth about Heughan and Caitriona Balfe just been exposed? For years, fans had speculated, theorized, and argued in circles. But there was always a line no one crossed, because Diana never crossed it. As the creator of Outlander, she had always been careful, sometimes even blunt, about separating fiction from reality. That was precisely why this moment felt different. Her words didn't sound like speculation. They sounded like familiarity. The context mattered as much as the comment itself. This wasn't a formal announcement or a headline-grabbing interview. It was a response, brief and unguarded, delivered with the confidence of someone who knows exactly how much power their words carry. She didn't name names directly. She didn't confirm or deny anything outright. But the implications sat heavy, unmistakable, and impossible to ignore. Almost immediately, fans began replaying the moment, parsing every syllable. The way Diana chose her phrasing. The pause before she answered. The subtle shift in tone when she referenced the long journey leading into 2026. To longtime followers, it felt like a door cracking open just enough to reveal something that had always been there. The names at the center of the storm were inevitable. Heughan and Caitriona Balfe had spent years walking a careful line between undeniable on-screen chemistry and strict off-screen discretion. Interviews were polite. Interactions were professional. Any personal connection beyond the script was consistently redirected or shut down. That consistency had always fueled suspicion. In an industry where cast members often overshare, their restraint stood out. Fans noticed how rarely they appeared together outside of official events, how carefully their words were chosen when discussing each other. It wasn't cold, it was controlled. And now, Diana's comment reframed that control as something intentional rather than coincidental. What made the moment explosive was Diana's position. She wasn't just an observer. She had been there from the beginning, casting discussions, early table reads, the evolution of characters that demanded emotional intimacy year after year. She had watched Sam and Caitriona grow not just as actors, but as people navigating a story that blurred lines between performance and reality. As reactions poured in, the fandom split almost instantly. Some fans felt vindicated, claiming this was the confirmation they had waited years for. Others pushed back, arguing that Diana was speaking metaphorically, referencing creative synergy rather than personal truth. But even among skeptics, one thing was clear: this wasn't being dismissed as nothing. The timing only added fuel. The mention of 2026 wasn't random. It aligned with a moment of transition for the franchise, a sense of closure hanging in the air. Diana's comment felt less like a tease and more like a signal, suggesting that certain truths could finally exist without threatening the story that had been so carefully protected. Social media erupted with old clips resurfacing, moments re-examined under a harsher light. Glances once written off as character immersion were now seen as something else. Long silences in interviews felt heavier. Even Diana's past insistence on boundaries began to look less like denial and more like protection. What unsettled fans most was not the possibility of a hidden truth, but the realization that they might have been witnessing it all along. That the most compelling parts of the story were never meant to be loud or obvious. They were meant to survive quietly, until the right moment arrived. As the day wore on, one narrative began to dominate. Diana hadn't exposed a scandal. She had exposed a tension between what is shown and what is known, between fiction that feels real and reality that must stay hidden. And by doing so, she shifted the entire conversation. The question now wasn't whether fans believed her. It was what would happen next. If this was only the first crack in the silence, then 2026 might not just mark an ending. It might mark the moment when a carefully guarded line finally disappears, leaving the truth standing alone in the open. Once the initial shock settled, the conversation shifted from what was said to why it was said now. Fans began to ask whether Diana Gabaldon had simply misspoken, or whether she had chosen this moment with intention. Timing, after all, is rarely accidental when it comes from someone who understands storytelling as deeply as she does. And 2026 suddenly felt less like a date on a calendar and more like a signal. For years, Diana had positioned herself as the gatekeeper between fiction and reality. She corrected fans when theories went too far, shut down rumors she felt crossed ethical lines, and defended the privacy of her cast with unusual firmness. That history made her recent words impossible to dismiss as careless. If anything, they suggested a recalibration of boundaries rather than a collapse of them. Attention quickly turned to Heughan and Caitriona Balfe, not as tabloid subjects, but as long-term collaborators navigating an extraordinary professional bond. Nearly a decade of portraying a relationship built on emotional intensity had required trust, vulnerability, and an unusual degree of mutual understanding. Fans began to wonder whether such a bond could ever remain purely performative. The more people revisited old material, the more the pattern stood out. Their interviews were respectful but restrained, warm yet carefully limited. They praised each other's professionalism without drifting into personal territory. In hindsight, that restraint looked less like distance and more like discipline, a shared agreement to protect something fragile from being consumed by speculation. Diana's role complicated everything. As the creator of Outlander, she had watched the boundary between character and actor blur in ways few outsiders could fully grasp. She had seen the cost of prolonged intimacy on screen and understood how quickly audiences confuse chemistry with entitlement. Her choice to speak now suggested that whatever truth existed no longer needed the same level of protection. Speculation about 2026 intensified. Some fans believed it marked a creative ending, a moment when the story's hold on its audience would finally loosen. Others suspected it was about personal freedom, the lifting of an unspoken obligation to maintain a certain illusion. Either way, Diana's words reframed the future as a moment of release rather than revelation. What followed was not confirmation, but recalibration. Media outlets shifted tone, moving away from sensational claims toward careful analysis. Fan discussions grew more reflective, less accusatory. The possibility that something meaningful had been deliberately kept private began to feel less like deception and more like respect for the people involved. Crucially, neither Sam nor Caitriona responded. Their silence didn't read as avoidance, it read as consistency. They had always declined to define their relationship outside of their work, and that hadn't changed. In the absence of denial or confirmation, the space Diana opened became a mirror, reflecting what fans wanted to believe more than what could be proven. As days passed, the intensity softened into something quieter. The idea that the truth might never be explicitly named began to feel acceptable, even appropriate. Not every story requires a final line spoken aloud. Some are complete precisely because they are allowed to remain intact without explanation. In the end, Diana Gabaldon hadn't exposed a secret so much as she reframed an understanding. She reminded the fandom that intimacy doesn't owe visibility, and that long stories sometimes deserve a gentle ending. If 2026 brings closure, it may not arrive with answers, but with permission to let certain truths exist without being claimed. Either way, Diana's words reframed the future as a moment of release rather than revelation.